We start with European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen and her speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Dr. von der Leyen was responding directly to threats from US President Donald Trump to impose new tariffs on European countries and to press ahead with his demand that the United States takes control of Greenland, a semi-autonomous Danish territory. In remarks closely watched across Europe and in Washington, the Commission chief warned that while the EU wants to continue working with the US, it is prepared to respond if Donald Trump escalates. So will European resolve be enough to shift Washington's position? Or is the confrontation over Greenland and tariffs now heading for a more direct clash?
Ursula von der Leyen knew everyone was watching her in Davos. What message would she send to President Donald Trump amid the political instability he has fanned, with threats to take over Greenland and impose tariffs on European countries?
Our response will be unflinching, united, and proportional. But beyond this, we have to be strategic about how we approach this issue.
The European Commission chief didn't specifically mention the EU's economic retaliation options being hotly debated in Brussels, in capitals, and surely in the margins of the World Economic Forum. Tit-for-tat tariffs, or what's called the trade bazooka or nuclear option, a mechanism that could severely limit U.S. companies' access to the EU market. But she underscored the inconsistency between Trump's threats against Europe and his claims that Russia and China are posing imminent danger to Greenland.
Plunging us into a downward spiral would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out of the strategic landscape.
But as von der Leyen was polishing her talking points, evidently taking care not to escalate rhetoric with the U.S., Trump was sending out his own signals, with no indication that compromise is what he sees on the horizon. Carnegie Europe director Rosa Balfour says the potential economic retaliation von der Leyen only alluded to in her speech should be made more explicit to the Trump team.
If the US administration pursues certain goals, there can be responses that will actually affect the US economy. There is leeway for Europeans to signal, to deter, to persuade, to force Trump to come to the table. And that is the goal.
But any European hope they've projected strength so far isn't getting through to Washington, judging from Trump's prediction for his planned discussions on Greenland in Davos.
Well, I don't think they're going to push back too much. Look, we have to have it.
As European leaders try desperately in Davos to change that plan, Greenland's prime minister is telling his citizens to be prepared for all scenarios.
Let's read the runes then with Riccardo Alcaro. He's head of research at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Welcome to DW. If Donald Trump goes ahead with his tariffs against 7 EU countries, is the EU really prepared to hurt its own economy by retaliating?
Well, that is the question of the day, isn't it? I mean, the Europeans are caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they are desperate to avoid a transatlantic rift of massive proportions, which would have serious implications not just on the economic front, but also potentially on the political front, because let's not forget that the United States still performs a fundamental function of guarantor of European security, and is still, even if it has downgraded under Trump its support for Ukraine, it is still a critical actor in terms of giving leeway and support to Ukraine itself. And on the other hand, they want to avoid the possibility of the United States acting predatorily against one of the EU member states, Denmark in this case, and taking territory out of coercion with no consent of local people, no regard.
So you've weighed up the two options. Which way do you think that they will actually jump?
They will try a middle ground. They will try to use the threat of retaliatory measures to raise the prospect of costs also for the United States, but it will also try to not really appease Trump, but to engage the Trump administration on the very topic the Trump administration is saying it is acting upon with regard to Arctic, which is Arctic security. So they will say they are definitely willing to increase security contributions to the Arctic area, and they are definitely willing to envisage a much greater role, security and economic-wise, by the United States on Greenland, provided the Greenlanders are in agreement with that.
Okay,
and
let me just interrupt you there, because really I want to press you on this, because everything that you've said there about European options and what they will do, this we know. So let's push it further. If you talked about what Europe would do, what Brussels would do, can we realistically say that the EU will stay united if retaliation hits German cars, French agriculture, or Italian exports first?
We cannot be 100% sure, but there will be a strong, really strong drive towards some form of retaliation, some form of response, which, if it doesn't happen at the EU level, it will happen at the level of some coalition inside the EU, and we will have to see what kind of response that coalition will be able to put out. But okay. I do expect the EU to remain united, at least on the threat of counter-tariffs.
Walk us through this. The US tries to impose sanctions against the 7 EU countries that publicly oppose Washington's plan to take over Greenland. The EU responds with its economic bazooka, and then the US sends troops into nuke anyway. Then what?
Well, there are a number of steps before the United States sends troops to nuke and Greenland. So I would say that if the United States is entirely unwilling to take European concerns and sensitivities in any regard, then we will have first a counter-tariff vote. And this is not about the bazooka, the anti-coercion instrument. If things deteriorate, then you could go there and have the European Commission take more coercive, more forceful action against American trade interests and investment interests in the United States. But in parallel with that, the Europeans will continue to push for a negotiated solution and will continue and will actually strengthen an outreach effort towards Congress, where the prospect of an American takeover of Greenland is absolutely not supported by a majority of members, and the broader foreign policy establishment in the United States at large, and eventually to the American public too, where consensus for a forceful takeover of Greenland is really, really low. So I would say that we have to expect this kind of course of action if indeed things deteriorate. But look, if at the end of the day, Trump disregards everyone and everybody inside the United States and in Europe and sends troops there, there is no real possibility for the European countries to militarily oppose that.
So we're clear on that. If American troops go into Greenland, that's the situation. We are stuck with it. We just have to swallow it. So what happens from there? What does a world in which the Europeans have accepted a US invasion look like? Do we continue to do business with the United States? Everything is up in the air, surely.
It would be, but the Europeans would not accept that. They would just be forced to suffer that, which is a different thing. They will continue to fight against it politically, diplomatically, economically. They will continue to make the case inside the United States with Democrats, with Republicans who are not aligned with Trump on this Greenland adventure, that they have to bring the Trump administration to renege on this. And if that doesn't happen, the Europeans only have one choice. They will have to invest massively, much more than they do now, politically, militarily, economically, in European Union integration in order to reduce their vulnerabilities to hostile action by hostile powers, China, Russia, even the United States, and also be very clear with the citizens that there will be costs to be paid, there will be costs to be suffered, but the stakes cannot be higher because we're talking about sovereignty and the ability of the Europeans not to be bullied over by anyone else in the world, even the United States.
Thanks for talking us through that, Riccardo. Riccardo Alcaro of the Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go through this with Jonas Parello-Plesner, who's director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation in Copenhagen. That's a non-profit organisation dedicated to the advancement of democracy. He's also a Danish former diplomat and specialises in China, the US and Europe. Welcome to DW. What do you think? Is the EU united enough for the whole bloc, all 27 members, to get behind economically damaging retaliation to US threats to just 7 countries over a place that most of them wouldn't have been able to place on a map 2 months ago?
Well, in short, I hope so. As a Dane and part of the Kingdom of Denmark, of course, among us, this is the only topic. Greenland, we talk about all the time. What's going to happen next? I just came out at a family dinner where this was, of course, also the big topic. So I do think that Trump is hitting at Europe, where it's most united typically. That's on trade, where there is actually, the Commission does have sort of the prerogative to negotiate on behalf of the member states, does have some really solid, at which you also mentioned earlier, possibilities for retaliation. So in that sense, we'll see. On Thursday after Davos, there will be a meeting in the European Council, where of course leaders had to look at these different options and see in what way what they're willing to use. But of course, I hope there will be this unified, as Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, was just speaking about a Davos response to Donald Trump's so far still threats of tariffs, because they've not been enacted but are due to come in effect in February.
OK, let's push back against that slightly. You say you hope that that's what will happen. We all hope that this won't come to anything, except that we live in the real world that Donald Trump has upended. So you hope that Germany will see its car exports decimated. You hope that French wine exports will be decimated. You hope that Italian exports will be decimated in the name of a land that is tiny and over which none of them have any particular financial or economic interest. You hope that they will take that action and damage their own economic interest on the basis for Greenland. This is your hope.
No, I hear what you're saying, Phil, but I do think there's a bigger principle at stake here. It's no longer just about a bilateral issue between Denmark, Greenland, and the US. It's also a fundamental principle of territorial sovereignty. It's also fundamental principles inside NATO that's at stake. If you suddenly have one member of NATO that threatens another member with territorial annexation, and as in this case, tariffs, that sort of fundamentally undermines the basic principles. So in that sense, all the countries that you just mentioned, they have that at stake as well. What kind of world order will we live in? And that's where I think that Europe has united to show that this is a joint European cause.
Let's follow that hope then. Let's say Donald Trump follows through on his threat to hit 7 EU countries with extra tariffs for opposing his takeover of Greenland. The EU then retaliates with more talking, as they do, then eventually hits the US with its big economic bazooka. The US ignores the bazooka, and then the next thing we know, there are US Marines all over Nook. NATO is dead. What happens next?
Well, that's the situation all of us want to avoid, as Ursula von der Leyen was saying. I
Fine.
mean, this sort of strengthens our adversaries.
Time is short. Everybody wants to avoid that,
sure.
But let's talk about what happens in that instance. What happens then?
Well, one thing I want to sort of just stop in your scenario is just, I think actually the fact that we are now in a terror war, however terrible that is going to be, that will probably also mean that you wouldn't see Trump kind of using the military weapon which you imply. I think this also sort of puts him, right now he's trying to coerce us into some version of giving up Greenland, and which then I think, I could be wrong, that makes it more unlikely that he's anyway going to try anything military at the same time, because otherwise why would you go into the trade fight?
Right. Except we're not in the trade fight yet, and we have seen Venezuela, we have seen ships, coercive force off the coast. This is what I want. I have ships to back me up. And then you have the Venezuelan president taken away. What makes you think that he's any less likely to do that in Denmark, which is much less likely to resist him than in Venezuela?
A couple of reasons. One, he has the friction from Congress, that you already have a resolution that's being passed around in Congress, including by Republican members, that will try to sort of make this action illegal. Two, the fact that the American military, which already operates in Greenland, could potentially also say, particularly if there is Congress deemed it so, that this is illegal. And three, any operational plan for the Greenland is very different from Venezuela, where you had a very sort of specific target to go in and get the legitimate president. How you would take over Greenland militarily, a country that's enormously vast, 4 times France, and with people sort of living in small settlements around the coast beyond the sort of 4-5 major cities, that's actually a little bit complicated. So it's not something. Yes, it's something the U.S. president potentially can order, but it's not something that's easily done. And you do have the friction with Congress. And I didn't actually add one more: is the American people. If you look at polls, this is highly unpopular. So there's no sort of major support for this, apart from in a sort of smaller part of the president's MAGA base. So heading into midterms later in the year, this might also actually be a sort of devastating action to take that could derail it for the president and his party, the Republican Party.
Donald Trump says he needs Greenland for national security and international security, even though existing treaties mean the US could station as many troops on Greenland as he wants. So if this land grab is not about US security, speculate for us. What is it about?
Well, he said several things. He talked about the minerals, the rare earths. He talked about the national security. He talked about the Russian and Chinese ships that are not there in that amount that he's talking about it. And he also, in one of the interviews, talked about psychological reasons, that this really kind of matters to him personally. I think that's probably the most dangerous for all of us, if it's the idea that he wants to be the president, and the first one since President Eisenhower, that expands the U.S. territory. I think all the other ones are possible in some way or the other to negotiate around. You could, as you also alluded to, expand the U.S. Basing rights in Greenland. You could have a much bigger deal on rare earths with a much bigger U.S. footprint. You could have Greenland and Denmark maybe come out with a sort of no autocrats invest in Greenland pledge to make sure the Chinese and Russians are kept 100% out. I think all of these things are doable. What's just not doable and non-negotiable is the fact if Trump really just needs the land, which is also unfortunately what could be behind when he talked about psychological reasons. So I think that one is the most dangerous, whereas national security, I think we can work on that. And that's where the NATO troops are up there right now. It's actually part of Arctic security. I mean, Denmark agrees that NATO Arctic security will be more important in the years to come. That's why the King of Denmark ups its defense budget with 5 billion as part of its new sort of 2 new Arctic packages.
Okay. Thank you for talking us through that, Jonas. Jonas Parello-Plesner from the Alliance of Democracies Foundation.
Thank you, Phil.